Hello, my dear friends. Tonight, I want you to dim the lights around you. Let the gentle hum of a fan or the profound silence of your room settle into your bones like an old, familiar blanket, and prepare to drift back into a past that feels at once tantalizingly familiar and bone-chillingly terrifying. Picture yourself stepping through the swirling mists of time, past the gleaming chrome and sterile safety of our modern world, back through decades of progress and regulation, until you find yourself standing on the soot-stained cobblestones of Victorian Britain. The year is 1850, and the air around you is thick with coal smoke that burns your lungs. The clip-clop of horses' hooves echoes off narrow brick buildings that lean toward each other like tired old men, and gas lamps flicker with yellow flames that cast dancing shadows on faces both hopeful and desperate. Because what I'm about to share tonight is not the familiar story of war with its cannons and cavalry charges, not the tale of plague with its black rats and festering boils, but something infinitely closer to home, something that touches the very core of human existence, something we often take for granted in our sanitized, regulated world. Food. Yes, food. The simple, fundamental act of nourishment. The bread that mothers broke at humble wooden tables, the colorful candies that made children's eyes light up with wonder, the creamy milk that was supposed to build strong bones, the very meals that Victorian families placed on their tables with prayers of gratitude and hope for another day of survival. But in those gaslit streets of London and Manchester, in the cramped tenements of Birmingham and the sprawling markets of Liverpool, food wasn't simply nourishment that sustained life and brought families together around flickering candles. It was a slow-acting poison, a silent killer dressed up in the familiar clothes of comfort and sustenance. This is the story of the deadly secrets of Victorian food, a story so disturbing, so fundamentally shocking in its systematic cruelty, it may forever change the way you look at your own pristine kitchen, your regulated grocery stores, your FDA-approved ingredients and safety warnings that we take for granted every single day. Candy-sweet poison in the candy jar picture. If you will, a small child with dirt under his fingernails and patches sewn carefully onto his worn wool jacket, tugging eagerly at his mother's threadbare dress in a bustling Victorian marketplace. The air around them is alive with the calls of vendors hawking their wares, the smell of roasting chestnuts mixing with the less pleasant odors of unwashed bodies and horse manure. Brightly colored stalls line the muddy streets, their wooden boards sagging under the weight of goods both wonderful and terrible. His mother, her face prematurely aged by years of hard labor and worry, her hands raw from scrubbing clothes in lye water, looks down at her boy's pleading eyes and feels her heart soften. She reaches into her thin leather purse, counts out precious copper coins that represent hours of backbreaking work, and smiles as she buys him a handful of bright white lozenges that gleam like tiny pearls in the dim afternoon light. The child's face transforms with pure joy as he pops one of the sweets into his mouth, his tongue immediately flooded with an artificial sweetness that seems almost magical after a diet of thin gruel and stale bread. He sucks happily on the candy, the white sugar dissolving slowly, coating his teeth and gums with what he believes is nothing more than innocent pleasure. But hours later, as the sun sets behind the sooty chimneys and gas lamps begin to flicker to life, he is doubled over in agony, his small body writhing in pain that no child should ever have to endure. His mother holds him close, helpless and terrified, as he vomits blood onto the rough wooden floor of their one-room tenement. By morning, he is dead, his lips still faintly stained with the white residue of the candy that killed him. This wasn't a rare occurrence, some freak accident that made headlines in the penny papers. It was horrifyingly, tragically common, as routine as sunrise and just as inevitable in the unregulated hellscape of Victorian food production. The culprit? Not some mysterious plague sweeping through the crowded slums, not contaminated water from the Thames, not even the industrial accidents that claimed so many workers, but the very candy sold openly at stalls and shops, marketed to children with bright signs and cheerful vendors who knew exactly what they were selling. Victorian sweets were deliberately and systematically laced with chalk scraped from quarry walls, alum that burned through stomach linings like acid, and even arsenic powder mixed directly into the sugar to add weight and bulk to increase profits. The brighter and more appealing the color, the deadlier it often was, as vendors competed to create the most eye-catching displays that would draw children like moths to a flame. Red lozenges were dyed with mercury sulfide, a compound so toxic that just a small amount could cause brain damage, organ failure, and agonizing death. Blue candies gleamed with their artificial color thanks to copper salts that corroded internal organs and caused copper poisoning that turned children's skin green before they died. White sugar, already expensive and precious, was stretched with plaster of Paris scraped from construction sites, creating a substance that hardened in children's stomachs like concrete. The most heartbreaking part was watching the children themselves become unknowing accomplices in their own destruction. They would beg their parents for the brightest, most colorful sweets, never knowing that the more beautiful the candy looked, the more likely it was to kill them. Vendors learned to make their displays as appealing as possible, arranging rainbow arrays of poison that sparkled in the gaslight like jewels. Doctors of the era recorded case after case of children collapsing after visiting fairs and markets, their mouths stained bright blue, vivid red, or shocking green, as though their candy was literally painting them into their own miniature coffins. Hospital wards filled with small bodies convulsing from metal poisoning, their parents weeping helplessly as medical professionals who barely understood germ theory struggled to treat symptoms they couldn't comprehend. The most tragic aspect was that many parents, seeing their children suffer after eating candy, would blame the child for eating too much or having a weak constitution, never suspecting that the treats they had lovingly purchased were actually instruments of murder disguised as innocent pleasure. French fries, the grease that never dyed the Victorian markets, didn't just assault your sense of sight with their colorful displays of poisonous candy. They absolutely reeked with the overwhelming stench of frying oil that seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, coating your throat and making your eyes water. But this wasn't the clean, golden oil we know today, carefully refined and regularly changed to maintain quality and safety. Victorian street vendors cooked their food in recycled animal fat that had been used for weeks or even months without ever being replaced or properly cleaned. This grease was often black as coal, rancid beyond description, bubbling and frothing with accumulated filth, food scraps, dead insects, and God knows what else that had fallen into the vats over time. Picture enormous iron cauldrons, their surfaces crusted with layers of burned fat and food debris, heated over open fires that filled the air with acrid smoke. The fat inside these vessels would be a horrifying mixture of tallow scraped from slaughterhouse floors, leftover cooking oil from multiple sources, and whatever other greasy substances vendors could acquire cheaply. Sausages made from mystery meat and sawdust, potatoes that had been sitting in dirty storage for weeks, and fritters made with flour that contained more weevils than grain would sizzle and bubble in these pans that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The sound was constant, the pop and hiss of food hitting the scalding grease, the bubble and splash of fat that seemed to have taken on a life of its own. When the stench grew so unbearable that even the desperate and hungry began to turn away in disgust, sellers would add anything they could find to disguise the smell. Cheap perfumes bought from back-alley chemists, turpentine that was meant for cleaning paintbrushes, or even splashes of gin or other alcohol that would temporarily mask the reek of rotting fat. The vendors themselves, their clothes permanently stained with grease and their hands black with accumulated filth, would call out to passers-by with cheerful voices, promising hot and fresh food, while knowing full well that nothing about their offerings was either hot enough to kill the bacteria or fresh enough to be safe. Families, driven by hunger that gnawed at their bellies like a living thing, ate anyway. Poverty had a way of dulling the senses and making even the most obviously spoiled food seem acceptable when the alternative was starvation. Children would watch grease dripping down their chins and think themselves lucky to have anything at all to eat, never knowing that every bite was introducing new colonies of bacteria and toxins into their already weakened systems. Workers coming off 12-hour shifts in factories and mills would stop at these stalls because they were cheap and filling, trading their health for the simple need to put something, anything, in their empty stomachs before trudging home to their overcrowded tenements. But with every bite, sickness seeped deeper into their digestive systems. Food poisoning became so common that many people accepted it as a normal part of life, not realizing that their frequent bouts of nausea, cramping, and diarrhea were directly caused by the poisonous conditions in which their food was prepared. Baby Bottle, the tragic silence of babies, but perhaps the most heartbreaking victims of Victorian food poisoning were the smallest and most innocent ones. The babies who had no choice in what they consumed, no ability to refuse what was given to them, no voice to protest the substances that were slowly killing them. In every pharmacy window throughout Britain, arranged like rows of tiny soldiers promising relief and peace, sat bottles of soothing syrup with labels that featured angelic infants and promised desperate mothers relief from the endless crying that accompanied poverty, hunger, and the general misery of Victorian life. These bottles, with their pretty labels and reassuring names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup and Godfrey's Cordial, were marketed directly to exhausted mothers who had reached the end of their rope. Women who worked 14 hours a day in factories, who came home to crying babies and no money for proper food or medicine, who lived in single rooms with their entire families and had nowhere to escape the constant noise and stress. The advertisements for these products were masterpieces of manipulation, featuring rosy-cheeked babies sleeping peacefully in their mother's arms, testimonials from satisfied customers praising the miraculous effects, and medical-sounding language that gave the products an aura of scientific respectability. What those bottles and their cheerful advertisements didn't mention, what was never written on the pretty labels with their flowery scripts and cherubic illustrations, was their true content. Morphine that could addict and kill, alcohol in concentrations that would be considered dangerous for grown adults, and opium that turned tiny bodies into drug-dependent shells. Picture a mother, her eyes red with exhaustion and worry, counting out her few precious coins to buy a bottle of syrup that promises to quiet her baby's cries. She measures out the recommended dose with a small spoon, watching hopefully as her infant's face relaxes and the crying finally stops. The relief is immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, she can rest, can think, can simply exist without the constant assault of screaming that had been driving her to the edge of madness. The baby sleeps deeply, peacefully, looking like the cherubic infants on the advertisement labels. But this peace comes at a terrible price. The babies fell quiet, yes, but sometimes they fell silent forever, their tiny bodies unable to process the powerful drugs that had been marketed as harmless remedies. Those who survived often became addicted, requiring larger and larger doses to achieve the same effect, their small bodies developing a dependence that would plague them for the rest of their shortened lives. These syrups killed thousands upon thousands of infants throughout the Victorian era, and yet society not only tolerated them but actively praised them as medical marvels. Newspapers ran advertisements featuring testimonials from grateful parents. Doctors recommended them as safe and effective, and pharmacists proudly displayed them in their front windows. The most horrifying aspect was that the deaths were slow and often went unrecognized as poisoning. Babies would simply become lethargic, stop eating, and gradually waste away while their parents believed they were suffering from some mysterious illness. The connection between the medicine and the deaths was rarely made, allowing the manufacturers to continue their deadly trade for decades. Even when concerned doctors began to speak out against these products, their warnings were drowned out by the marketing campaigns and the desperate testimonials of parents who had become dependent on the temporary relief these poisons provided. Cup with straw cocaine in the soda glass. If the idea of drugged babies shocks you to your core, prepare yourself for something even more disturbing. Imagine schoolchildren, innocent and trusting, sipping bottles of cocaine-laced soda as casually as modern children drink juice boxes, their young minds and bodies being systematically poisoned by what their parents believed was harmless refreshment. These weren't hidden or illegal substances sold in dark alleyways by shadowy figures. These were legitimate products, fizzy and sweet and flavored with artificial cherries or exotic herbs, sold openly in apothecaries and grocery shops throughout Britain and America. The bottles were beautifully designed, with colorful labels featuring healthy, energetic children and promises of vitality, mental clarity, and physical vigor. The marketing was brilliant in its manipulation of parental concerns. These tonics promised to help sickly children gain weight, to give shy children confidence, to help struggling students perform better in school. Parents who could afford these expensive treats believed they were giving their children a healthy advantage in life. Children would arrive at school bright-eyed and buzzing with artificial energy, their pupils dilated and their hands shaking slightly from the stimulants coursing through their bloodstream. Teachers noticed that certain students seemed unusually alert and talkative in the morning, only to crash dramatically in the afternoon, becoming lethargic, irritable, and unable to concentrate. The cycle was insidious and addictive. Parents, seeing their children's initial improvement in energy and mood, would buy case after case of the cocaine-laced sodas, never realizing they were fueling a chemical dependence that would alter their children's brain development permanently. Picture a typical Victorian pharmacy, its shelves lined with hundreds of bottles promising miraculous cures and improvements. Behind the polished wooden counter, a pharmacist in a clean white coat would cheerfully recommend cocaine tonics to concerned parents, explaining with scientific-sounding language how the coca leaf extracts would stimulate the nervous system and improve mental function. Children as young as 5 or 6 would develop habits around these drinks, craving them with an intensity that worried their parents but was dismissed by medical professionals as simple preference for a tasty treat. The idea that children could become addicted to substances was not yet understood, and the long-term effects of regular cocaine consumption on developing brains was completely unknown. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that these products were often given to children who were already struggling with health problems or learning difficulties. Parents desperate to help their sickly or slow-developing children would spend precious money on these tonics, believing they were providing medical treatment when they were actually adding drug addiction to their children's existing problems. Shortcake cakes made of lime and ash, even the most joyous occasions, the birthday celebrations and holiday feasts that should have brought families together in happiness and gratitude, were poisoned by the systematic contamination of Victorian baking practices. Picture a typical Victorian bakery in the early morning hours, before the customers arrive to see the gleaming displays of bread and pastries. The baker, his apron already stained with flour and sweat, stands before enormous mixing bowls, adding ingredients that would horrify modern health inspectors. Desperate to make their dough rise higher and their bread appear whiter than their competitors, bakers would routinely mix their batter with quicklime scraped from construction sites, chalk powder stolen from schoolhouses, and alum that burned like acid through anyone unfortunate enough to consume it. The quicklime, which was normally used in construction to create mortar, would react violently with the moisture in people's stomachs, creating a chemical reaction that could burn holes through intestinal walls. The chalk, often contaminated with lead and other heavy metals from its industrial sources, would accumulate in the body over time, causing neurological damage and organ failure. Even the most innocent and joyful moments were tainted by this systematic poisoning. Birthday cakes, symbols of celebration and love, sparkled under frosting that contained plaster of Paris mixed directly into the sugar to create a bright white appearance that looked more expensive than it was. Imagine a Victorian family gathering around their humble wooden table, a father who has worked 16 hours a day all week to afford this small luxury, children whose eyes light up with wonder at the beautiful white cake their mother has somehow managed to purchase. They sing songs of celebration, say prayers of gratitude, and carefully cut slices with their best knife, each family member taking their portion with reverence and joy. But every bite of that beautiful cake was corroding their insides, the plaster of Paris mixing with stomach acid to create a concrete-like substance that would harden in their digestive systems. The pretty white frosting that looked so elegant and expensive was actually industrial material meant for construction, not consumption. For the poor, who could rarely afford such luxuries, these contaminated treats represented special occasions made possible by tremendous sacrifice. Parents would go without meals for days to save enough money to buy a cake for a child's birthday, never knowing that their loving gesture was slowly poisoning their entire family. For the wealthy, who could afford to buy bakery goods regularly, the situation was no safer. Even the most expensive bakeries in the finest neighborhoods used these same contaminated ingredients, as the practice was so widespread and unregulated that pure ingredients were nearly impossible to find at any price. The most heartbreaking aspect was that families treasured these moments, creating happy memories around meals that were literally killing them. Children would remember for the rest of their lives the taste of their birthday cake, never knowing that the sweet memory was associated with their first exposure to industrial toxins. Cookie biscuits glazed with death biscuits and cookies, those simple pleasures that brought joy to children throughout the Victorian era, carried their own unique brand of horror that was particularly insidious because of how appealing they were made to look. These treats, beloved by children everywhere and often given as rewards for good behavior or small tokens of affection, often gleamed with a bright white glaze that caught the light and made them appear almost magical in their pristine beauty. But that lustrous sheen that made children's mouths water and their eyes shine with desire came from lead oxide, a highly toxic industrial chemical that was used because it created such a beautiful, glossy finish that customers were willing to pay premium prices for the attractive appearance. Picture a Victorian child, perhaps one who has been particularly well-behaved or has completed their chores without complaint, being rewarded with one of these special glazed biscuits. The natural instinct of any child would be to lick the pretty, shiny surface before taking a bite, their small tongues running across the smooth glaze to taste the sweetness before committing to eating the entire treat. With that innocent lick, they were directly ingesting lead oxide into their bloodstream, a substance so poisonous that even tiny amounts accumulated over time could cause devastating health problems that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The lead would immediately begin its deadly work, weakening their developing bodies at the cellular level, making their small hands tremble uncontrollably, and interfering with their brain development in ways that would affect their ability to learn, think clearly, and function normally as they grew older. Many children who regularly consumed these glazed biscuits developed what medical professionals of the era called painter's colic, a condition named after painters who suffered similar symptoms from exposure to lead-based paints. The children's bodies would twist and contort in agony as the lead poisoning progressed, their nervous systems slowly shutting down under the assault of accumulated toxins. The symptoms were particularly cruel because they developed gradually over time. Parents would notice that their once active children were becoming lethargic and listless, that their bright, curious minds seemed to be growing dull and unfocused, that their steady hands were developing an uncontrollable shake. Many families would blame these changes on other factors. Perhaps the child was simply growing up and losing their youthful energy, or maybe they were coming down with some mild illness that would pass with time. The connection between the beautiful, expensive biscuits and the gradual deterioration of their children's health was never made. The most tragic cases involved children who had shown particular promise in their studies or their crafts, young minds that had been bright and quick before the lead poisoning began its destructive work. Teachers would notice that students who had once been eager to learn were becoming unable to concentrate, that children who had shown artistic talent were losing the fine motor control necessary for drawing or writing. Strawberry jam of corpses, ice cream of fire, even the most innocent and beloved treats, the simple pleasures that represented everything good about childhood and family life, were transformed into instruments of slow torture by the unregulated nightmare of Victorian food production. Fruit jam, that staple of Victorian households that mothers would carefully spread on bread for their children's breakfast, represented one of the most disturbing examples of how the pursuit of profit could transform wholesome ingredients into deadly poison. This jam, which families treasured as a way to preserve the fleeting sweetness of summer fruits through the long, cold winter months, was preserved not with the pure sugar that modern consumers take for granted, but with formaldehyde, the exact same chemical that undertakers use to embalm corpses and prevent decomposition in dead bodies. Picture a Victorian mother in her small, cramped kitchen, carefully measuring out precious spoonfuls of jam onto slices of bread for her children's morning meal. She believes she is providing them with nutrition and sweetness, a small luxury that will brighten their day and give them energy for their work or schooling. But with every spoonful, she is feeding them a chemical designed to preserve dead tissue, a substance that would slowly pickle their living organs from the inside out. The formaldehyde would accumulate in their bodies over time, interfering with their cellular function and gradually poisoning them in the same way it preserved dead bodies in mortuary preparation rooms. The irony was horrifying. Families were consuming a substance whose primary purpose was to prevent the decay of corpses, never knowing that they were essentially embalming themselves while still alive. Ice cream, that innocent delight that brought joy to children on hot summer days, carried its own special brand of horror that was perhaps even more cruel because of how much children loved and craved it. This frozen treat, which should have been nothing more than cream, sugar, and natural flavors, was routinely stiffened with alum, a harsh industrial chemical that burned through stomach linings like acid and caused bloody diarrhea that could lead to severe dehydration and death. Imagine children on a sweltering Victorian summer day, their faces flushed with heat and their small bodies desperate for relief from the oppressive temperatures. They would spot an ice cream vendor with his colorful cart and beg their parents for the precious coins needed to buy a small portion of the frozen delight. The ice cream would taste wonderfully cool and sweet as it melted on their tongues, providing immediate relief from the heat and filling them with the simple joy that only children can experience from such a simple pleasure. They would savor every bite, making the treat last as long as possible, their faces lighting up with happiness. But within hours, the alum would begin its destructive work. The children would double over with stabbing pains in their stomachs as the industrial chemical burned through their delicate digestive systems. They would begin vomiting and experiencing bloody diarrhea that would leave them weak, dehydrated, and sometimes dying from the very treat that had brought them such joy only hours before. Parents, seeing their children suffer after eating ice cream, would often blame the cold temperature of the treat for causing stomach upset, never suspecting that their children were actually suffering from chemical poisoning. The cycle would repeat throughout the summer, with families continuing to buy ice cream despite the frequent illnesses, because the connection between the frozen treat and the symptoms was never properly understood. Cut-of-meat meatballs of waste, perhaps the most grotesque and nauseating practice in all of Victorian food production, was the creation of what vendors cheerfully called meatballs, a term that was such a complete misrepresentation of reality that it bordered on criminal fraud. These weren't made from actual meat in any sense that modern consumers would recognize or accept. Instead, they were horrifying combinations of waste products that should never have been considered fit for human consumption, mixed together with spices and cooking techniques designed to disguise their true nature from desperate customers who had no other options. Picture the back rooms of Victorian slaughterhouses, where the real meat was carefully cut and prepared for wealthy customers who could afford to be selective about their food sources. On the filthy floors of these processing areas, covered in blood, sawdust, and waste, workers would sweep up everything that had been discarded during the butchering process. Lungs that had been removed because they were diseased or damaged, hooves that contained no nutritional value but added weight to the mixture, intestines that may have been filled with waste and parasites, and even ashes that had been swept from the slaughterhouse floors would all be collected in large barrels and sold to street vendors who specialized in creating cheap food for the working poor. These vendors would take this mixture of waste and offal back to their preparation areas, where they would grind it together into a paste that bore no resemblance to actual meat. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, a combination of rotting flesh, industrial waste, and the accumulated filth of slaughterhouse floors. To disguise the horrifying stench and make the mixture palatable enough that starving people would be willing to eat it, vendors would add heavy doses of nutmeg, cinnamon, and other strong spices that would temporarily mask the smell of decay. They would then form this paste into small, round patties and fry them in the same rancid grease that was used for all street food, creating a product that looked like actual meatballs to hungry customers who couldn't afford to be too discerning. The most tragic aspect of this practice was who these fake meatballs were marketed to. Factory workers, who labored 16 hours a day in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered rent for a single room, would buy these patties because they were the only protein they could afford. Mothers with starving children would spend their last coins on what they believed was real meat that would give their families the nutrition needed to survive another day. Children, their small bodies already weakened by malnutrition and the various other toxins they were exposed to in their daily lives, would eat these meatballs with gratitude, never knowing that they were consuming a mixture of waste products, industrial chemicals, and parasites that would introduce new illnesses into their already compromised immune systems. The parasites and bacteria that thrived in these waste-based meatballs were particularly dangerous because they had been allowed to multiply in the perfect breeding ground of rotting organic matter mixed with slaughterhouse waste. Every bite introduced new colonies of harmful organisms into consumers' digestive systems, spreading diseases that ranged from mild food poisoning to fatal infections that could kill within days. Glass of milk and eggs that never were even the most basic and fundamental foods, the simple staples that formed the foundation of Victorian diets, were subject to adulteration and fraud that turned them into dangerous substitutes that bore little resemblance to the natural products they were supposed to represent. Milk, which should have been nothing more than the natural product of healthy cows grazing in clean pastures, underwent a transformation that was both economically motivated and deadly in its execution. Fresh milk from rural farms was expensive to transport and had a short shelf life, making it costly for urban vendors who needed to maximize their profits to survive in the competitive food marketplace. To solve this problem, vendors would routinely water down their milk supplies, sometimes diluting them to the point where the liquid contained more water than actual milk. But watered-down milk looked exactly like what it was: thin, bluish, and obviously diluted. Customers would immediately recognize that they were being cheated and would refuse to buy the obviously inferior product. To solve this problem, vendors would thicken the mixture again using whatever white substances they could find cheaply in bulk quantities. chalk scraped from quarry walls, starch that was sometimes contaminated with industrial chemicals, and plaster of Paris that was meant for construction use would all be mixed into the diluted milk to restore its thick, white appearance that would fool customers into believing they were buying pure, undiluted milk. Picture a Victorian mother, carefully counting out her precious coins to buy a pitcher of milk for her children's breakfast. She believes she is providing them with calcium for strong bones and protein for healthy growth, following the advice of medical professionals who recommended milk as an essential part of children's diets. Instead, she is serving them a mixture of contaminated water, industrial chalk, and construction materials that will gradually poison their developing bodies, while providing almost none of the nutritional benefits that real milk would have delivered. The situation with eggs was even more disturbing because it involved complete fraud rather than simple adulteration. Real eggs, with their protein and fat content, were relatively expensive and had a limited shelf life, making them difficult for poor families to afford and for vendors to stock profitably. Rather than simply diluting real eggs or mixing them with other ingredients, some vendors eliminated them entirely, creating fake eggs that were made from paste, molded into shell-like shapes, and painted to resemble the real thing. These artificial eggs would be carefully crafted to look identical to natural eggs, complete with realistic coloring and surface texture that would fool customers who were making quick purchases in crowded marketplaces. The paste inside these fake shells was made from various industrial substances mixed with dyes and flavoring agents to create something that would temporarily pass for real egg when cooked quickly. Families would proudly serve these fake eggs to their children, never realizing they were feeding them a mixture of industrial paste and artificial chemicals instead of the natural protein source they believed they had purchased. The deception was so complete that many families would never realize they had been defrauded, instead believing that their eggs simply didn't taste as good as they remembered from their childhood. This was the normal, everyday, completely legal food system that operated openly in full view of government officials, medical professionals, religious leaders, and social reformers who all knew exactly what was happening and yet allowed it to continue for decades. Markets throughout Britain proudly displayed their contaminated wares in brightly lit stalls, with vendors calling out cheerfully to advertise food they knew was poisonous. Bakeries operated in full view of their communities, with customers able to watch the baking process that included adding industrial chemicals to their daily bread. Pharmacies displayed bottles of opium-laced baby medicine in their front windows, with advertisements that featured smiling infants and testimonials from satisfied parents. Government inspectors, when they existed at all, were either too few in number to make any meaningful difference, or they were systematically bribed by food producers who had far more money and political influence than the reformers trying to expose them. The few officials who did try to investigate and report on food contamination found their reports buried in bureaucratic processes or dismissed by politicians who were more concerned with protecting business interests than public health. Religious institutions, which should have been advocating for the protection of the poor and vulnerable, often invested their money in the same businesses that were producing contaminated food, making them complicit in the system rather than advocates for change. Churches that preached about caring for children and helping the needy were simultaneously profiting from industries that were systematically poisoning those same children and families. Reformers and doctors who understood the scope of the problem and tried to warn the public found themselves fighting against a system that was designed to silence their voices. Medical professionals who published papers documenting the connection between contaminated food and widespread illness were dismissed as alarmists or troublemakers who were interfering with legitimate business practices. The most horrifying aspect was that the people producing and selling these poisonous foods knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a case of ignorance or accidental contamination. It was deliberate, calculated murder for profit, carried out by people who went home to their own families each night knowing that they were slowly killing their neighbors' children. Newspaper advertisements proudly promoted products that the advertisers knew were deadly, using language carefully crafted to suggest health benefits while avoiding any actual responsibility for the results. Testimonials from satisfied customers were often fabricated entirely, or they came from people who had been paid to provide positive reviews before their children died from the very products they were endorsing. For decades, Victorian Britain prided itself on being the most civilized, scientifically advanced, and morally superior society in human history. The British Empire spanned the globe, bringing what they claimed was civilization and moral guidance to primitive peoples around the world. all while their own citizens at home were being quietly killed by the very meals they trusted most. The systematic nature of this poisoning revealed a society that valued profit above human life, that prioritized the appearance of prosperity over the reality of health and safety, and that was willing to sacrifice its most vulnerable members' children, the poor, and the sick in order to maintain the economic systems that benefited the wealthy and powerful. Candle closing reflection. So, my dear friends, as you prepare to drift off to sleep tonight in your warm, safe beds, surrounded by the comforts of modern life that we so often take for granted, the next time you picture Victorian life in your mind's eye, the romantic gas lamps glowing warmly in the misty streets, the elegant carriages clattering over cobblestones with their well-dressed passengers, the grand balls and elaborate fashions that seem so charming in historical dramas, remember this darker truth that hides behind the pretty pictures. Remember that the meals on their tables, the food that sustained their daily lives and brought families together around humble wooden tables, were not the wholesome nourishment that we imagine when we romanticize the past. They were slow-acting poison, carefully disguised and systematically distributed, turning the most basic human need, the need for food, into an instrument of death. Not by mistake, not through ignorance or accidental contamination, but by deliberate design, by the calculated decisions of people who knew exactly what they were doing and chose profit over human life, again and again, day after day, year after year. Think about the children we've met tonight in our journey through Victorian Britain. The small boy with dirt under his fingernails who died from white candy that gleamed like pearls. The babies who fell silent forever after their mothers gave them soothing syrup that contained more opium than medicine. The school children who arrived at their lessons buzzing with cocaine-laced energy only to crash into listless despair by afternoon. Think about the mothers who scraped together their last coins to buy what they believed was milk for their children's breakfast, never knowing they were serving chalk and plaster dissolved in contaminated water. Remember the fathers who worked 16-hour days in dangerous factories to afford a birthday cake for their child, never suspecting that the beautiful white frosting contained the same plaster used to build the walls of their tenement. These weren't statistics in a government report or abstract historical facts to be memorized and forgotten. These were real people with hopes and dreams and love for their families, who trusted a system that betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible, by poisoning the very sustenance they needed to survive. The most haunting aspect of this story is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. Children grew up expecting to be sick after eating candy. Parents accepted that babies often died mysteriously in their sleep. Families learned to live with constant stomach ailments and unexplained illnesses because these symptoms were simply part of daily life in their world. They didn't know that in future generations, food would be regulated and inspected, that ingredients would be listed on labels, that there would be government agencies dedicated to protecting consumers from exactly the kind of systematic poisoning they endured every day. They couldn't imagine a world where children could eat candy without fear of death, where babies could be soothed without being drugged, where families could share meals without playing Russian roulette with their lives. As you lie in your bed tonight, perhaps reaching for a glass of clean, safe water from your tap, or thinking about tomorrow's breakfast of regulated, inspected food from your local grocery store, remember that the safety you take for granted was built on the graves of countless Victorian children who died so that future generations could learn the importance of food safety and government oversight. Their deaths were not in vain if we remember them, and if we never forget how quickly civilization can crumble when profit becomes more important than human life, when businesses are allowed to operate without oversight, when the vulnerable are sacrificed for the convenience of the powerful. And if you thought their food was horrifying, just wait until you hear what they rubbed on their skin in the name of beauty. The face creams made from mercury that ate through flesh like acid, the powder made from arsenic that gave fashionable ladies the pale complexion they desired while slowly destroying their organs, the deadly paints and cosmetics that rotted the faces of queens and commoners alike from within. But that story of Victorian beauty standards and the lethal lengths people would go to achieve them, that tale of vanity turned to horror and fashion transformed into a death sentence, is a journey for another night, when the moon is dark and the world is quiet enough to hear the whispers of history's most beautiful ghosts. Sleep well tonight, my dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the simple gratitude for clean food, safe water, and the knowledge that the meals waiting for you tomorrow were made by people who care more about your health than their profits. May you never take for granted the invisible protections that surround you. built by generations of reformers who fought to ensure that eating would never again be an act of faith that could cost you your life. And may you remember, when you see the romantic images of Victorian life in movies and books, that behind every beautiful facade of that era lay a darker truth, that the pursuit of profit without conscience, the acceptance of suffering as inevitable, and the willingness to poison the innocent in the name of progress created a world where the most dangerous thing a person could do was simply try to stay alive. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with a renewed appreciation for the safety and security that previous generations died to give you.